Imagine a future where the U.S. military is not just an engine of power, but a lightning rod for America's most divisive cultural battles, where the question of who gets to wear the uniform is no longer just about fitness or patriotism, but about identity, diversity, and ideology. Now picture that future coming to a head, not on a distant battlefield, but in the heart of American politics, commanding headlines and congressional hearings. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on a fight about much more than morale, one that could determine the shape, soul, and strength of the world's most powerful military. When President Donald Trump strode onto the stage at West Point, addressing a sea of young cadets poised to become the next generation of American leaders, he wasn't just marking a rite of passage, he was firing the opening salvo in a new kind of war. The days of absurd ideological experiments and drag shows are over for the American military, he declared, his voice ringing through the hallowed academy. He promised a new golden age, and to his supporters, it sounded like an end to years of social projects, diversity efforts, and what he called distractions from the military's true mission. But that's just one chapter in a much longer, messier story. For decades, the U.S. military has been more than a fighting force. It's been a mirror, reflecting the country's evolving struggles with race, gender, and equality. Today, with the future of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, programs under fire and culture war rhetoric raging, the stakes have never been higher. Is the military losing its edge, or evolving to fight tomorrow's wars? And what do soldiers think, caught in the crossfire between tradition and transformation? To understand what's at stake, let's rewind the clock. The United States military wasn't always the arena for heated debates about identity. In fact, at its birth, necessity often overrode ideology. During the American Revolution, when every shoulder counted, African Americans fought alongside their white counterparts, not because the Founding Fathers had a progressive vision, but because they needed manpower. Yet, as soon as victory was secured, new policies slammed the door shut, excluding Black Americans from service, a stark reminder of the military's uneasy relationship with social change. Fast forward to the Civil War. Once again, the desperate need for troops led the Union to recruit hundreds of thousands of Black soldiers. Their performance on the battlefield was beyond question. They proved their valor, sometimes in the face of deadly discrimination. But after the war, instead of recognition and integration, they faced fresh waves of segregation, set in stone by Jim Crow laws and racist military policies that would take nearly a century to unravel. By World War I, the military's approach to diversity was less about justice than assimilation. The Foreign Soldier Service was invented, an audacious experiment to turn new immigrants into Americans, one drill and one order at a time. The logic: unity at any price, even if it meant erasing old identities. It's a pattern that would repeat: diversity for necessity, but not always for its own sake. World War II. Now here's a twist. The military not only called up Black soldiers again, but also embraced something almost unthinkable today: drag shows. Staged for battle-weary troops from Europe to the Pacific, these performances, sometimes starring future U.S. President Ronald Reagan as a morale booster, united soldiers in laughter, camaraderie, and a fleeting escape from the horrors of war. What was once embraced for morale is now a flashpoint in today's culture wars. How did that shift happen? If you think progress came quickly, think again. Even with President Truman's 1948 executive order to desegregate the armed forces, change was glacial. Black soldiers often endured separate barracks, denied promotions, and outright discrimination. The Army's infamous 1925 Hayes Report had deliberately distorted Black soldiers' records from WWI, justifying the policies that held back so many for so long. But the winds were starting to shift. By the late 20th century, especially after Vietnam, the military found itself at the center of broader fights for equality. Women began breaking barriers and serving in combat roles. LGBTQ+ Americans came out of the shadows. Formal DEI initiatives, diversity training, targeted recruitment, and new offices dedicated to inclusion grew from side projects to central policy. On paper, many of these programs aimed for a simple but radical goal: a fighting force that looks like the nation it defends and harnesses every ounce of talent it can get. Yet even as that mission took root, it was never uncontested. Critics, especially on the political right, saw diversity initiatives as costly distractions, even dangers. We're trying to save the military from a pernicious ideology that can have a very negative effect on warfighting capability, warned Rebecca Heinrichs of the Heritage Foundation. Legal challenges mounted too. Some argue DEI programs violate equal protection, suggesting the Supreme Court's recent crackdowns on affirmative action could spell doom for race-conscious recruitment and retention. The numbers show the fight isn't only about principle, it's about power. In April 2025, lawmakers faced off in the House Armed Services Committee over amendments to the National Defense Authorization Act. Their target: DEI budgets, social programming, and the hot-button issue of drag shows. As of May 2025, drag shows are now outright banned on U.S. military bases, a direct response to mounting Republican criticism and a dramatic reversal of what once was a routine, even celebrated, part of military morale. But why such fierce resistance? For many, the answer is simple. War is hard, and unity is everything. DEI seeks to undermine cohesion, unity of purpose, and duty to a higher cause through the binary of oppressed and oppressor, said retired naval officer J.A. Cawthon, echoing the view that identity politics sow division, not teamwork. Others, like Donald Critchlow of the Center for American Institutions, argue DEI programs run contrary to typical American ideals. But the critics don't go unchallenged. Many leaders and active duty personnel believe diversity is not a luxury, it's a strategic necessity. Diversity is essential to our effectiveness. It does not distract, it focuses, insisted Representative Andy Kim of New Jersey in 2023. Lindsey Cohn of the Naval War College added, "A more diverse military is a more capable military, better able to understand and respond to a complex world." The research is far from settled. A June 2024 report by the Center for American Institutions at Arizona State University slammed DEI efforts as ineffective, even harmful, arguing that they undercut the core ethos of the military: discipline, unity, and readiness. Yet just months later, the Rand Corporation released a study suggesting the opposite, finding that inclusive leadership training could actually improve teamwork and effectiveness on the battlefield. Marek Posard, a Rand analyst, put it bluntly: diversity training ensures productive conversation on race, gender, or sexual orientation, so we don't have things blow up. So which is it, asset or liability? The reality is, both narratives are colliding inside the Pentagon and on Capitol Hill. The Air Force Academy now weaves courses on race, ethnicity, gender, and sexuality into officer training, making inclusivity central to leadership development. Meanwhile, a 2022 survey by Blue Star Families found that racial slurs and discrimination still haunt barracks and bases all over America, showing that new policies alone can't erase generations of prejudice overnight. The political temperature is only rising. In 2023, Senator Tommy Tuberville single-handedly blocked hundreds of military promotions because of the Pentagon's abortion access policy, a vivid reminder of how the culture war can paralyze not just debate, but leadership itself. And in 2024, the Department of Defense's Inspector General launched a sweeping review of how merit, not identity, governs promotions and assignments, signaling a renewed push for what some call a back-to-basics military. You might ask, how does all this debate affect the boots on the ground? For young service members, the reality is complicated, personal, and at times painful. Public polling and private surveys suggest that while most soldiers care most about competence and trust in their teammates, stories of discrimination and marginalization still surface with unsettling regularity. "I am offended at the implication that conducting extremist training means that our military is filled with extremists," said Senator Tammy Duckworth, herself a combat veteran, challenging the notion that efforts to root out bias are themselves evidence of systemic rot. Even as policies change, the underlying question persists. Can the U.S. military reconcile the demands of inclusion with the unyielding logic of warfighting? And can it do so in a way that attracts and retains the best talent from every background, without alienating those who feel that tradition and unity are being sacrificed on the altar of social engineering? It's a fragile balance, and one that's already having real-world consequences. Some fear that perceived bias or ideological overreach is making recruitment harder, especially among groups who see themselves as targets of new policies. Others warn that sidelining DEI will deter talent from communities vital to building a force ready for modern threats. According to the research, the consequences may ripple for decades, shaping not just who serves, but how effectively America's military can respond to an unpredictable world. As the dust settles over West Point and the political battles rage on, the U.S. military stands at a crossroads. Will it emerge more unified and lethal, or more divided and distracted? The answers, and their impact, could reverberate from Congress to the front lines, and far beyond. But here's the burning question that remains. If the military is truly entering a new golden age, whose vision will define it, and at what cost? In the next part, we'll dive deeper into the real-life impacts, the data behind the arguments, and the next great tests facing the U.S. Armed Forces as this ideological showdown plays out. So, how do these ideological and policy shifts actually affect the men and women in uniform and the very future of America's security? To answer that, we need to look forward. What happens next is not only about political headlines or speeches at West Point, it's about the daily realities in barracks, training fields, recruitment centers, and war zones. The choices made in Washington ripple outward to every soldier's experience and ultimately to the nation itself. Let's unpack the possible futures now confronting the U.S. military, given today's titanic clash over diversity, equity, and inclusion policies. One scenario leads to a military that walks away from DEI entirely, banning drag shows, removing race-conscious recruiting, and gutting diversity offices. Proponents say this shift will laser-focus the armed forces on their core mission, defeating threats and defending the country. They argue that removing ideological distractions restores discipline, unity, and the warrior ethos. And yes, there's a historical precedent, the post-World War II era, when the U.S. military, at least outwardly, set aside social projects to concentrate solely on readiness and overwhelming force. But there's another side. Critics of this rollback warn of dangerous consequences. If DEI and related initiatives are scrapped, the military might become less attractive to minorities, women, or LGBTQ+ recruits whose trust and aspirations could evaporate. Recruitment, which is already struggling, could plummet further. Remember, the Army missed its recruiting goal by 15,000 personnel just 2 years ago. Morale issues could deepen if service members perceive the institution as hostile or exclusionary. Even more insidiously, critics argue, the armed forces could lose one of their greatest assets, the capacity to unite Americans from every background in pursuit of a shared purpose. Here's what's at stake. Recruitment is the lifeblood of any military. Without a steady stream of new volunteers, America's all-volunteer force simply doesn't function. The Department of Defense has admitted that Gen Z recruits are the most diverse in U.S. history and the most skeptical of top-down authority. Policies seen as excluding, disrespecting, or ignoring their identities risk alienating the very people the military needs to replenish its ranks. As Rep. Andy Kim said, diversity is essential to our effectiveness. It does not distract, it focuses. But push too hard on DEI programs, and you face backlash from those who feel the pendulum has swung too far. Some soldiers and commanders believe identity-based policies create suspicion and division, eroding the trust that must bind units together in combat. Rebecca Heinrichs puts it bluntly, we're trying to save the military from a pernicious ideology that can have a very negative effect on warfighting capability. What does this battle mean for those in uniform right now? Interviews and surveys reveal a complicated reality. Blue Star families reported that discrimination and racial slurs are still a problem for many military households. Yet there are also officers who resent being told that their service is tainted by systemic bias. For some, mandatory diversity training feels preachy or irrelevant. For others, the military still feels closed to outsiders or minorities, especially in elite roles. Meanwhile, the debate is far from settled among experts. The Rand Corporation's recent study claims that inclusive leadership training, done right, can actually boost team performance and communications, reducing the risk of toxic incidents. Lindsay Cohn from the Naval War College agrees. A more diverse military is a more capable military, better able to understand and respond to a complex world. But the force faces an identity test not seen since Truman ended military segregation. Imagine the risk if even a small percentage of recruits, especially future cyber warriors, drone operators, or medics, choose other careers because they feel unwelcome. The U.S. could lose a competitive edge not just in numbers, but in brain power and adaptability. Let's get concrete. In April 2025, Congress sparred over amendments to strip or limit DEI programs from the defense budget. Supporters said, that's money back to weapons and training. Opponents replied, you're telling millions of Americans they're not wanted in uniform. Then there's the ongoing review by the Inspector General, scrutinizing whether promotions and assignments really are fair, or if DEI has meant quotas and box checking. The stakes? Trust in meritocracy. If soldiers believe promotions are anything less than earned, discipline suffers and teamwork frays. If, however, subtle bias is ignored, real talent can be wasted or driven out. It's a delicate balance, and the world is watching how America will strike it. On top of all this, the military must reckon with shifting public opinion and a drastically changed battlefield. 21st century warfare often demands cross-cultural skills, language expertise, and technological innovation. The enemies America faces now, terrorist networks, cyber attackers, near-peer rivals, exploit division and social rifts. A force that cannot draw on every American's talent may find itself outmaneuvered in the wars of tomorrow. So, what are the practical lessons for you, the viewer, as all this unfolds? First, recognize that the debate over DEI and military culture is not just a political talking point, but a real-world issue with life-or-death consequences. These policy choices will determine who fights, who leads, and how effectively the nation responds to crises. If you or someone you know is considering military service, pay attention to the evolving climate. Will the institution welcome your identity, or will you face obstacles that can sap morale? Equally, if you value the country's safety, you must ask, are policies improving or harming readiness, and how do we even measure that? Second, don't fall for easy answers. Both sides wield powerful symbols: the flag, sacrifice, unity, and the promise of equality. But the truth, as history reveals, is messy. The U.S. military has always changed, sometimes swinging between openness and exclusion, sometimes using diversity as a weapon of war, sometimes collapsing under its own contradictions. Only by grappling with this complexity can America avoid repeating old mistakes. Third, participation matters. This is not a fight confined to generals and politicians. U.S. military tradition says every citizen and every taxpayer has a stake in how the armed forces are shaped. If you care about who gets to defend America and on what terms, raise your voice. Tell your representatives your views. Mentor young people weighing service. Demand transparency about performance, not just talking points. And finally, a deeper lesson. The health of a society's military mirrors the health of the nation itself. When Americans are divided over race, gender, ideology, the military absorbs those shocks. But when the military manages to unite people toward a shared mission, it can become a rare engine for national progress, as it did during the integration after World War II. So, as we reach our conclusion, let's circle back to the hook. Is DEI vital or destructive to military readiness? The answer is, it depends on how it's implemented, and how leaders, both civilian and military, manage the inevitable friction. If DEI devolves into box checking or lowers standards, it can indeed fracture the bonds that hold units together in battle. But when rooted in shared sacrifice, respect for merit, and a commitment to equip every soldier to succeed, diversity can be a force multiplier, one that makes the U.S. military more adaptable, innovative, and resilient for the fights ahead. The military's story is one of constant adaptation, often lagging behind society but sometimes leading it. Today, the experiment continues, with no guarantee of success. The real danger lies not in disagreement, but in refusing to confront hard questions about who we are and what we value. And here's a secret fact that few recall. During World War II, the U.S. military not only tolerated but actually produced drag shows as part of official morale-building efforts. Movie stars, even future President Ronald Reagan, participated in entertaining the troops this way. The same institution now debating whether such events should be banned once used them as weapons in the fight for victory. History rarely moves in straight lines. Ultimately, whether you support or oppose DEI in the military, the core mission remains: to defend the nation and its ideals that have always been contested, revised, and renewed by every generation of Americans in uniform. The future depends on leaders and citizens who can bridge divides and make tough, principled decisions. The question is not just who fights, but why and for what future. If this video challenged your assumptions or gave you new perspective, let us know your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe diversity strengthens or weakens the military? Would you or someone you love serve under the current climate? Subscribe for more deep dives into the forces shaping America's future, and share this story with someone who cares about the country's security. Thanks for watching. Until